My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my life, I've been someone people describe as reasonable, the steady one, the one who listens more than she speaks, the one who doesn't overreact, doesn't push, doesn't make things uncomfortable. I've never been the loudest person in the room. I don't dominate conversations, and I don't announce my boundaries unless I'm asked, something that I've learned rarely happens when people assume you'll always be agreeable. In my family, especially, I was seen as the practical one, the responsible one, the person who would understand no matter what decision was made. And for a long time, I did. People often mistake calm for compliance. They think that if you don't protest, you must agree. If you don't argue, you must be fine. If you don't draw attention to yourself, then your needs must not be urgent. That misunderstanding shaped the role I quietly stepped into over the years. Useful, dependable, and largely invisible. This story isn't about a single explosive moment. It's not about shouting matches, dramatic revenge, or proving anyone wrong in public. It's about something much quieter and in some ways more unsettling. It's about how trust can erode in small, reasonable seeming steps, how boundaries can be crossed without malice, simply because no one expects resistance. $25,000 was taken from my savings without my consent, money I had worked for, planned around, set aside as security. It wasn't stolen in the way people imagine theft. There was no break-in, no panic, just a calm assumption that my money was available because I was family and because I wouldn't make a fuss. But this isn't just a story about money. It's about what money represents when you've spent years being the accommodating one. Safety, autonomy, the right to decide for yourself. It's about what happens when the people closest to you make choices on your behalf. Believing your silence means permission. What follows is not a tale of retaliation. There's no sudden transformation where I become ruthless or cold. Instead, there's a gradual internal shift, a moment where silence stops being endurance and starts becoming strategy, where observation replaces explanation, where clarity replaces hope. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration, because I believe many people, especially within families, will recognize the patterns long before they recognize the damage. This isn't about assigning villains or demanding sympathy. It's about understanding how easily quiet people can be overstepped and how power doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like patience. This is a story about psychological reversal, about reclaiming agency without raising your voice, about what happens when the person everyone underestimated finally stops explaining herself. As you listen, I invite you to pay attention not just to what happened to me, but to how familiar it feels. To the moments where you might think, I would have let that slide too. To the places where silence seemed easier than conflict. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, something worth sitting with. Have you ever realized that people were making decisions about your life simply because you stayed quiet long enough for them to believe they could? To my family, I was the easy one. That wasn't something anyone ever said out loud, but it lived in the way conversations flowed around me. Decisions were made quickly when I wasn't in the room. Plans were solidified before I was consulted. And if I did raise a question, it was usually met with a smile and some version of, "You're fine with it, right?" They weren't wrong, at least not at first. I had spent years being fine with things, not because I lacked opinions, but because I believed harmony mattered more than being heard. I believed that love was proven through flexibility, that being dependable was a form of contribution, and I was good at it. I remembered birthdays. I helped cover gaps. I noticed what others didn't want to deal with and quietly handled it. In family gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks while conversations happened over my shoulder, the one listening carefully while everyone else spoke freely. If someone needed help with paperwork, logistics, or planning, my name came up quickly. If someone needed emotional reassurance, I was trusted. If someone needed money advice or a safety net, I was considered practical enough to understand. I didn't feel resentful about this at the time. I felt useful, needed. And in families, usefulness is often mistaken for belonging. I had a stable job and lived well within my means. I saved consistently, not because I was ambitious, but because security mattered to me. My savings weren't a secret, exactly, but they weren't something I announced either. Still, over time, people noticed. I was labeled the responsible one, the one who didn't struggle, the one who would be okay even if things went sideways. That label came with a quiet assumption. If I was okay, then my resources were flexible. My time was flexible. My boundaries were flexible. I didn't correct that assumption. Part of me thought it would sound selfish. Another part believed that if I ever truly needed to say no, people would understand. After all, we were family. We loved each other. Surely no one would take advantage of that. But looking back, I can see how invisibility begins, not through neglect, but through praise. Being told you're so understanding enough times eventually turns into an expectation that you always will be. Being described as low maintenance slowly becomes permission to overlook you. And being calm long enough convinces people that nothing will disturb you. I absorbed more than I realized. Small comments, casual jokes, little dismissals wrapped in affection. No single moment felt significant enough to challenge. Each one was easy to rationalize. They didn't mean it like that. It's not worth making a big deal. This is just how families are. So I stayed quiet. I smiled. I adapted. From the outside, it probably looked like confidence, like maturity, like emotional intelligence, but inside, something else was happening. I was shrinking my reactions, editing my instincts, postponing my discomfort for a future version of myself who would somehow handle it better. In their eyes, I became predictable, reliable, safe, and predictable people are easy to plan around. No one asked me what role I wanted to play in the family. It was assigned gradually, through repetition. I was the one who would cope, the one who wouldn't take things personally, the one who didn't need checking in on. I didn't realize it then, but that role came with a cost. Because when people stop checking in with you, they also stop asking for permission. And when you've trained everyone around you to believe you'll always understand, the line between trust and entitlement becomes dangerously thin. At that point in my life, I still believed that silence was kindness, that patience was a strength, that being underestimated was harmless. I didn't yet understand that being unseen is not the same as being safe. The first time it happened, it didn't feel like a betrayal. That's important to say, because if it had, I might have reacted differently. I might have spoken up sooner. But the truth is, the first small cut was wrapped in reason, delivered casually, and softened by familiarity. It was a conversation I wasn't meant to overhear. We were gathered at my parents' house for one of those ordinary weekends that blur together over the years. Nothing celebratory, nothing tense. Just family moving around each other out of habit. I was in the kitchen rinsing a mug when I heard my name from the living room, not in concern, not in conflict, but in passing. "She won't mind," someone said. The sentence landed softly, almost kindly, no edge to it, no warning, just an assumption, stated as fact. I remember standing there longer than necessary, the water running, my hands still. I didn't hear what came before that sentence, and I didn't hear everything that followed, but I didn't need to. That phrase, "she won't mind," told me exactly where I stood in the discussion. Later, when I asked what they were talking about, the explanation came quickly and confidently. A small decision, a temporary adjustment, something done for convenience, nothing permanent, nothing serious. And again, I was told, "You understand?" I nodded. I always did. That was the moment I should have felt uneasy, but I didn't. At least not fully. Instead, I felt a dull pressure in my chest, the kind you ignore because you don't want to seem dramatic. I told myself it wasn't about me, that it wasn't worth unpacking. Families sometimes make choices on the fly. What bothered me wasn't the decision itself. It was how invisible my voice had been in the process, not ignored, preempted. They hadn't decided against me, they had decided for me. That distinction mattered, though I didn't yet have the language for it. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared, small, forgettable on their own. A change of plans I learned about after the fact. A financial detail was mentioned casually, as if it had already been agreed upon. Each time there was an explanation ready. Each time someone smiled as they spoke, confident that I'd absorb it without friction. And each time I did. I told myself that speaking up would make things awkward, that it would create tension where none was intended, that I didn't want to be the person who complicated everything. Silence felt easier, cleaner, more mature. But silence has a way of teaching people what they can get away with. I began to notice how often my consent was assumed rather than requested, how decisions were phrased as updates instead of questions. No one ever said, "We didn't ask you because we didn't think you'd care." But that was the message underneath every interaction. What unsettled me most was how normal it all seemed to everyone else. No one looked guilty, no one acted secretly, there were no hushed tones or guilty glances, just comfort, familiarity, the ease of people who believe they're doing nothing wrong. That's when I realized something important. Harm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried by people who love you and believe they're being reasonable. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even argue. I simply filed the feeling away, like a note written to myself for later, a reminder that something had shifted, even if no one else noticed. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. But once you notice the first small cut, you start seeing where the blade came from and how often it's been used before. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That was the problem. Life continued exactly as it always had. Family gatherings still felt familiar. Conversations still flowed easily. No one treated me differently. And because nothing looked wrong, it became easier to convince myself that nothing was wrong. The moments that unsettled me began to repeat, but never loudly enough to demand attention. Plans would shift without warning. Someone would mention an arrangement as if it had already been finalized, and I would realize I was hearing about it last. Financial conversations happened around me instead of with me. When I hesitated, even briefly, there was always reassurance ready. It's not a big deal. It's just temporary. You're not the kind of person who gets upset over things like this. Each sentence was delivered gently, almost affectionately, and each one placed me further into a role I hadn't consciously agreed to play. I began to rationalize it. I told myself that my family trusted me, that involving me less was actually a sign of confidence. I told myself that speaking up would make me seem petty. I didn't want to damage relationships over things that would eventually sort themselves out. Most of all, I told myself that this was normal. Those families blur boundaries. That money, time, and decisions become shared by default. That being close means being flexible. And if I felt uneasy, that was my own sensitivity to manage. So I managed it internally. I edited my reactions before they reached my face. I smoothed over questions before they became objections. I smiled through updates that should have been conversations. The discomfort didn't disappear, but it did become familiar. And familiarity can be mistaken for acceptance. Over time, I noticed something subtle but significant. People stopped checking my expressions. They stopped pausing after explaining things to see how I felt. The assumption of my agreement had become automatic. I was no longer being included. I was being accounted for. That distinction matters. Inclusion invites participation. Being accounted for reduces you to a variable already solved. The more I stayed quiet, the more efficient everything became. For everyone but me. I started hearing phrases like, "Rachel's fine with it," said in my absence. Decisions carried my name as justification, even when I hadn't been consulted. And when I gently questioned something, the response wasn't hostility, it was surprise, as if I had deviated from a script they didn't realize I'd been given. I remember one moment clearly. Someone paused mid-sentence and said, almost laughing, "You're not seriously upset about this, are you?" It wasn't a challenge, it was confusion, as though the idea itself didn't make sense. I shook my head and said no. That was the moment I felt something settle, heavy but quiet, a realization I couldn't unsee. My emotional range had been defined for me. Discomfort from me was considered unlikely, maybe even inappropriate. I had become emotionally predictable, and emotional predictability makes people careless. I wasn't angry yet. I was tired. Tired of translating my boundaries into something more palatable. Tired of telling myself that silence was maturity when it was really avoidance. Tired of being the person who didn't mind when no one had bothered to ask, but still I stayed quiet. Not because I was weak, but because I was still hoping that things would correct themselves, that someone would notice the imbalance, that I wouldn't have to be the one to disrupt the peace. That hope kept me compliant far longer than it should have. Because when disrespect is normalized, it stops feeling like something being done to you and starts feeling like something you're responsible for tolerating. And that's a dangerous shift. I didn't realize it then, but by rationalizing their behavior, I was slowly erasing my own authority over my life, not in one moment, but in dozens of small ones. Each time I chose comfort over clarity, I taught everyone around me what they could expect from me. I was still trusted, still liked, still needed, but I was no longer fully seen. And once people stopped seeing you clearly, they stopped seeing your limits at all. The role wasn't given to me in a single moment. It formed slowly, the way habits do, through repetition, through expectation, through what goes unchallenged. By the time I became aware of it, I had already been playing it for years. I was the reliable one. Not the favorite, not the most outspoken, not the one people worried about. I was the one who would handle it, whatever it happened to be. Logistics, emotional labor, loose ends. I was the person others leaned on without thinking about the weight they were placing on me. In my family, roles were unspoken but clearly defined. Some people needed protecting, some needed accommodating. Some were allowed to be difficult because that's just how they are. I was the one expected to adapt. That expectation came disguised as respect. You're strong, they'd say. You're independent. You don't need help like the others. Each compliment quietly removed another reason to consider my limits. I noticed how often responsibility found its way to me. If something required organization, my name came up. If a decision needed justification, my presumed approval was cited. If resources were needed, time, attention, patience, I was assumed to have them. And if something went wrong, I was expected to understand. Understanding became my currency, the thing I traded for peace. I told myself that being dependable was a virtue, that stepping up was simply what adults did, that family meant showing up even when it was inconvenient. But over time, I realized something uncomfortable. My reliability had made me predictable, and my predictability had made me expendable. No one worried about losing me. Not really, because they believed I would always be there, always adapt, always smooth things over. My presence was treated as a constant, not a choice. I wasn't consulted about that role. I grew into it because it was easier than resisting it. And resisting it would have required me to do something I wasn't used to doing, disappoint people. I avoided disappointment like conflict. I believed it fractured relationships. I believed that if I stayed reasonable, stayed calm, stayed flexible, things would stay intact. What I didn't understand was that avoiding disappointment doesn't preserve closeness. It redistributes power. Slowly, subtly, the balance shifted. I noticed how rarely anyone asked what I wanted. Not out of cruelty, but out of assumption. I had become the background structure of the family, like a wall no one noticed until it cracked. When conversations turned serious, I was often informed, not invited. When money was discussed, it was framed as logistics, not consent. When boundaries should have been negotiated, they were treated as already established. And the boundaries they imagined for me were wide, almost non-existent. I remember thinking, if I say no now, it will seem abrupt. If I question this, it will look selfish. If I assert myself, it will change how they see me. That fear kept me compliant. But there was another realization forming beneath it, quiet, insistent, impossible to ignore forever. I wasn't being respected for my calm. I was being relied on for my silence. There's a difference between being trusted and being used. I had crossed that line without noticing when it happened. The role I was assigned wasn't malicious. It was convenient. And convenience rarely asks for permission. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction carried new weight. Every assumption stood out. Every "you'll be fine with it" echoed louder than before. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Because awareness doesn't always lead to action right away. Sometimes it just creates distance. A quiet step back, a moment of observation. I was beginning to understand the system I was in, and my place within it. And understanding, I would soon learn, is the first step toward changing it. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic discovery. If anyone had been watching closely, they would have seen an ordinary afternoon unfold exactly the way it always did. But inside me, something finally stopped settling. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, going through my accounts the way I did once a month. It wasn't anxiety that drove the habit, it was routine. I liked knowing where I stood. Numbers to me were grounding. They told the truth without interpretation. At first, I thought I was reading it wrong. I refreshed the screen, I checked the date. I scanned the transaction again, slower this time, as if the meaning might change if I looked at it long enough. $25,000. Transferred out of my savings. There was no alert, no warning, no message asking if it was okay, just a clean line item, already processed. Final. Efficient. My first reaction wasn't panic. It was disbelief. Not at the money itself, but at the assumption behind it. It took quiet confidence for someone to move that amount without speaking to me first. The certainty that I would understand. I would accept the explanation later. That my consent could be retroactive. I sat there for a long time, hands folded, heart steady in a way that surprised me. I wasn't shaking, I wasn't crying, I wasn't even angry yet. I was clear. For the first time, the pattern wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't about tone or assumptions or being left out of conversations. It was concrete, documented, irreversible. This wasn't carelessness. This was entitlement. I thought back to every moment I had stayed quiet, every time I had nodded instead of questioned, every time I had absorbed discomfort so no one else had to feel it. This was what that silence had been training them for. I didn't call anyone right away. That was the real shift. The old version of me would have reached out immediately, seeking context, smoothing things over before they could escalate. I would have listened carefully, reassured everyone that I wasn't upset, and quietly carried the weight of it myself. But something in me had changed. I realized that if I reacted too quickly, I would be reacting inside their frame, not mine. I would be responding to their justification instead of honoring my own boundaries. So I stayed still. I opened a notebook and began writing down facts. Not feelings, not accusations, just what I knew. Dates, amounts, access points. Who had the authority to move funds, how that authority had been granted, and how casually. As I wrote, another realization surfaced, calm and unmistakable. No one involved thought they were doing anything wrong. That clarity was unsettling, but also strangely grounding, because it meant this wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about a system that worked exactly as designed. A system where my silence filled in for my consent. I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not rage, not sadness, but resolve. A quiet decision is forming beneath the surface. Not about punishment, not about confrontation, about change. I understood then that explaining my feelings wouldn't be enough. Appealing to empathy wouldn't fix this. The imbalance was structural, not emotional. And structures don't change because you ask nicely. They change when the rules are rewritten. That afternoon, I made a promise to myself. I would not rush. I would not announce. I would not demand understanding. I would observe. I would prepare. And I would make decisions that didn't require permission. The money mattered, but what mattered more was what it represented. control over my own life, the right to decide how much access others had to me, financially, emotionally, psychologically. By the time the sun went down, nothing had happened outwardly. But internally, the version of me who absorbed everything quietly had stepped aside. In her place was someone calmer, clearer, no longer waiting to be considered. That was the day something shifted. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, something I used to keep things smooth to avoid discomfort, to preserve harmony. Now it was intentional, measured, chosen. I didn't withdraw from my family. I didn't act cold or distant. On the surface, nothing looked different. I still showed up. I still listened. I still responded when spoken to. That familiarity worked in my favor. Because when people believe nothing has changed, they stop paying attention. I began to listen more carefully than ever. Not to what people said, but to how they said it. Who assumed what? Who spoke with confidence about decisions they didn't technically have the right to make? Who felt entitled to explain after acting instead of asking before? I noticed patterns I had been too involved to see before. Money was always framed as temporary. Access was always justified by urgency, and my supposed flexibility was treated as a resource, not a gift. What surprised me most was how comfortable everyone seemed. There was no sense of risk, no hesitation. They moved as if my cooperation were guaranteed. And in a way, it had been. I didn't correct them, not yet. Instead, I started gathering information, quietly, methodically. I reviewed old messages, bank authorizations, and account access histories. I didn't do this out of paranoia, but out of respect for reality. If I were going to make decisions, they would be informed ones. I also paid attention to myself. I noticed how much energy I had been spending managing other people's comfort, how often I preempted reactions that were never my responsibility to prevent, how deeply I had internalized the belief that my needs were disruptive. Letting go of that belief was uncomfortable at first. Silence without self-erasure felt unfamiliar, but it also felt honest. I realized that speaking up too soon would only reset the cycle. They would apologize, explain, promise it wouldn't happen again, and then expect everything to return to normal. The structure would remain intact. I wasn't interested in temporary reassurance anymore. So I let them believe I was still the same, and they did. Conversations continued, plans were made. I was still referred to as easygoing, still described as not the type to overreact. Each assumption confirmed what I already knew. They didn't see me as a variable. That invisibility, once painful, had become useful. I began documenting, not as a threat, but as insurance. I learned how access had been granted, what could be changed, and what required formal action. I educated myself quietly, without announcing concern. There was no adrenaline in it, no sense of revenge, just clarity. I understood now that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits, observes, gathers context. And silence, when chosen, can be a form of leverage. I stopped explaining myself internally. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I accepted that some people only understand boundaries when they encounter them, not when they're described. That acceptance brought an unexpected sense of peace. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't angry, I was simply no longer available for assumption. And that shift changed everything, even if no one else could see it yet. Because the moment you stop reacting on cue, you step out of the role assigned to you. And when you do that quietly, people don't realize they're losing control until it's already gone. What they never noticed was how much time I suddenly had. Not because my life had slowed down, but because I had stopped spending energy managing expectations that were never mine to carry. The mental space that opened up was subtle, but it was powerful, and I used it carefully. Outwardly, I was still the same Rachel, same tone, same presence, same reliability. I didn't correct assumptions or challenge narratives. I let people talk. I let them explain. I let them feel comfortable. Comfort makes people careless. While they were relaxed, I was paying attention. I began to see the system clearly, not just who did what, but how decisions flowed. Who initiated, who approved, who benefited, and who was always expected to absorb the consequences quietly. It wasn't just about the money anymore. The $25,000 had been a catalyst, not the core issue. The real problem was access. Who had it, who assumed it, and who never questioned whether it should exist at all. I learned more in those weeks than I had in years of participation. I reviewed account structures. I read policies I had skimmed over before. I asked neutral questions in unrelated conversations, phrased as curiosity rather than concern. No one thought twice about answering. Why would they? I wasn't challenging anything. I was just listening. I also started documenting patterns, not in an accusatory way, but in a factual one. Dates, conversations, assumptions made on my behalf. I didn't attach emotion to these notes. Emotion clouds judgment. I treated it like research. And in that process, something else became clear. They didn't think they were exploiting me. They thought they were including me. In their minds, my resources were shared because we were close. My silence was agreement because it always had been. The system had grown around my passivity so gradually that it felt natural to them. That realization didn't make me angrier, it made me more precise. Because you don't dismantle something by attacking intentions, you dismantle it by changing access. I also paid attention to how they spoke about me when they thought I wasn't listening. The language was consistent. She's fine. She doesn't need much. She's not like the others. I had been flattened into a concept, useful, uncomplicated, endlessly accommodating. They never noticed when I stopped reinforcing that image. I didn't volunteer as much. I didn't fill every silence. I let small inconveniences remain unresolved unless someone explicitly asks for help. And when they did ask, I responded, but on my terms. The shift was subtle enough to go unnoticed, but it mattered. At the same time, I was educating myself, quietly, thoroughly. I learned what could be changed without announcement and what required formal steps. I learned where authority actually lived versus where it was merely assumed. Knowledge has a grounding effect. It removes fantasy. It replaces fear with options. I wasn't preparing for confrontation. I was preparing for independence. There were moments when I felt the old reflex rise up, the urge to explain myself preemptively, to soften what I was doing so no one would feel unsettled. Each time, I paused. I reminded myself, clarity does not require permission. Boundaries do not need to be rehearsed aloud to be real. What they never noticed was that my silence was no longer an invitation. It was a closed door. I had stopped being emotionally accessible in the ways that made assumptions easy. I still cared, but I no longer overextended. And without that excess, the system they relied on began to thin. Not collapse, not yet, just weaken. They didn't notice because they weren't looking for change. They believed the pattern was stable, that I was stable, that everything would continue as it always had. People rarely notice preparation, they notice a reaction. And by the time the reaction is visible, preparation has already done its work. I wasn't becoming someone else, I was becoming exact. And the more exact I became, the less room there was for anyone else to define me. The reveal didn't come with a rush of adrenaline. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no dramatic realization that snapped the world into focus. Instead, it arrived slowly through confirmation, through paperwork, through facts lining up so cleanly that there was no longer any room for interpretation. I remember the exact evening it settled in. I was alone, sitting on the floor of my living room, documents spread out in careful rows, not scattered, not frantic, ordered, intentional. I had been reviewing access histories, authorizations, and account structures for weeks by then, cross-checking what I thought was true with what actually was. And that's when I saw it. The access to my savings, the ability to move that money, had never been temporary. It hadn't been an emergency workaround. It had been quietly permanent, put in place years earlier, justified at the time as just in case, and then never revisited. I had agreed to it once in a very different context, under very different assumptions. What I had not agreed to was this: unilateral decisions, retroactive explanations. My autonomy is being treated as optional. The private reveal wasn't about discovering a villain, it was about discovering the gap between what I believed I had consented to and what had actually been happening. That gap was wide, and no one had crossed it accidentally. The system had been operating smoothly because it relied on something specific: my predictability, my discomfort with confrontation. My belief is that good intentions excuse bad boundaries. Seeing it clearly didn't make me emotional. It made me still. I realized then that nothing I said would undo what had already been normalized. Even if they apologized, even if they promised change, the structure itself had been proven unsafe for me. And safety, real safety, doesn't depend on someone else's restraint. It depends on the design. I also realized something else, just as important. I had leverage. Not in the sense of threat or exposure, but in the sense of control over my own access points, over permissions that could be revised, over systems that could be redesigned quietly, legally, and completely within my rights. That knowledge didn't feel empowering in the way movies depict empowerment. It felt sober, grounded, final, because leverage carries responsibility. It meant that what I chose next would shape not just outcomes, but identities, mine and theirs. It meant that once I acted, there would be no pretending things hadn't changed. I didn't rush into that decision. Instead, I sat with clarity. I let myself grieve, not the money, but the illusion, the belief that being easygoing had protected me, the hope that trust would be honored simply because it was given. I understood now that trust without boundaries isn't generosity, it's exposure. And exposure invites misuse, even from people who don't see themselves as cruel. That night, I didn't call anyone. I didn't rehearse conversations. I didn't imagine confrontations. I simply closed the folder, stacked the documents, and put them away. The reveal wasn't something I needed to share. It was something I needed to act on. For the first time, I felt completely aligned with myself. Not defensive, not uncertain, just clear about what I would and would not allow going forward. The leverage I had wasn't about forcing anyone to acknowledge wrongdoing. It was about removing the conditions that made wrongdoing possible. And that kind of power doesn't announce itself. It waits. Once you see the full shape of something, you can't pretend you don't. That was the position I found myself in after the private reveal. The facts were clear. The access points were mapped. The assumptions were undeniable. What remained was choice. And there were several paths available to me. I could confront them immediately, lay everything out, demand explanations, ask for the money back, and insist on apologies. That path would have been emotionally satisfying in the short term. It would have allowed everyone to perform remorse, to reassure me that it would never happen again. But it would have left the structure intact. I could also stay silent and change nothing, absorb the loss, accept the reality that this was simply the price of peace. That path was familiar, comfortable in its own way. It required no disruption, only continued self-erasure. That option, I knew, was no longer available to me. There was a third option, less visible, less dramatic, but far more consequential. I could remove access, not as punishment, not as retaliation, but as a boundary. It was so clear it didn't require explanation, a shift so structural it would redefine what was possible going forward. That option came with a cost. It meant accepting that some people would feel blindsided, that they would experience loss without understanding why, that they might frame the change as betrayal rather than consequence, and I would have to let them. I sat with that reality longer than I expected, because choosing that path meant giving up something I had relied on for years, the comfort of being seen as reasonable. I would no longer be the easy one. I would be the one who changed the rules. The final decision didn't come in a rush. It arrived quietly, one evening as I watched the city lights outside my window. I realized I wasn't afraid of their reaction anymore. I was afraid of repeating myself, repeating the cycle, repeating the silence, repeating the mistake of prioritizing others' comfort over my own safety. That fear was clearer and heavier than any fear of conflict. So I decided, I would act without announcement. I would not ask permission to reclaim what was mine. I would not seek understanding before securing my boundaries. I would not soften the impact to preserve an image that had never protected me. The decision was irreversible because it wasn't about behavior, it was about access. Once access is removed, everything else must reorganize around that absence. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt resolved. This wasn't a move designed to teach anyone a lesson. It was designed to protect me from ever being placed in this position again. I understood that the consequences would ripple outward. Those questions would arise. Those narratives would shift. But for the first time, those narratives would not be centered on my compliance. They would have to adapt to my absence. And that, I realized, was the only decision that truly honored what I had learned. I didn't tell anyone what I was about to do, not because I wanted secrecy for its own sake, but because explanation invites negotiation. And negotiation would have pulled me back into the very dynamic I was trying to leave. So I moved quietly. The first steps were practical, almost boring in their simplicity. I scheduled meetings, I reviewed documents, I asked precise questions and took careful notes. Everything I did was legal, standard, and entirely within my rights. There were no loopholes, no shortcuts, no emotional decisions disguised as strategy. Just corrections. I changed access points one by one. Not dramatically, not all at once. Each change was deliberate, designed to close a door that had been left open for far too long. I updated permissions, I revised authorizations, I separated accounts that should never have been linked in the first place. Each step reduced vulnerability. And with each reduction, I felt steadier. Not empowered in a loud way, but settled. Like furniture being returned to its rightful place after years of imbalance. What struck me was how little resistance there was, because no one knew yet. Silence in this phase wasn't avoidance, it was alignment. My actions matched my understanding. There was no gap between intention and behavior. I also made decisions beyond the financial. I stopped volunteering information. I redirected conversations that edged toward assumption. When asked for help, I responded thoughtfully instead of automatically. No explanations, no apologies. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was recalibrating my availability. There were moments when I paused, aware of how unfamiliar this felt. The old reflex to announce, to reassure, to soften still surfaced occasionally, but I didn't indulge it. I reminded myself, boundaries don't require audience participation. As I moved through these steps, I noticed something unexpected. I slept better. The background tension I had carried for years, the constant readiness to adapt, began to fade. I wasn't bracing for updates or explanations anymore. I had reclaimed a sense of authorship over my own life. That sense of authorship changed how I moved through the world. I became less reactive, more intentional. Not colder, just clearer. I no longer preempted outcomes. I let people experience the results of their own assumptions. Because for the first time, those assumptions had nowhere to land. By the time everything was finalized, weeks had passed. Life had continued as usual on the surface. Conversations happened, plans were discussed, no alarms were raised. And that was the point. Change doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply arrives, fully formed, and waits to be noticed. I wasn't hiding what I had done. I was done explaining myself in advance. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was complete. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up as small disruptions, conversations that stalled halfway through, plans that felt less certain, pauses where confidence used to be. I could sense it before anyone said anything directly. The rhythm had changed, and people didn't yet know why. Someone mentioned a delay. Someone else shrugged and said they'd sort it out later. There were glances exchanged, brief, uncertain, quickly dismissed. No one came to me right away. That was telling. They assumed it was a temporary inconvenience, a technical issue, something that would resolve itself, the way things always had. Because in their minds, I was still part of the background system, still available, still flexible. I listened. I watched how discomfort moved through the family now that it no longer landed on me, how quickly irritation surfaced when solutions weren't immediate, how often my name almost came up and then didn't. It was subtle, but it was there. The first direct question came days later, framed carefully, casual, almost polite. "Hey, quick question. Do you know why this isn't going through?" I looked at them, calm, present, genuinely curious. "No," I said, and I meant it. That answer disrupted something, not because it was rude, but because it didn't perform the role they expected. I didn't follow up with offers. I didn't speculate. I didn't rush to fix it. I let the silence sit. They nodded, a little thrown off, and moved on. From that point on, the pattern repeated. Questions were asked sideways. Comments were made indirectly. Frustration leaked out in small ways. Tone shifts, impatience, mild defensiveness. Still, no one addressed the root issue, because addressing it would require acknowledging something else. That access had been lost. Those assumptions had failed. That I was no longer filling the gap. People rarely confront loss directly when they believe it's reversible, so they circled it. I could feel the narrative beginning to form, one that didn't include wrongdoing, only inconvenience. I was no longer easy, but I wasn't yet difficult. I was absent. And absence is harder to argue with than refusal. What struck me most was how quickly the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, but noticeably. The ease was gone. Conversations became more cautious. Decisions took longer. Responsibility started bouncing around, looking for somewhere to land. No one said my name aloud in those moments, but everyone felt it. There was a quiet resentment building, not toward me specifically, but toward the disruption itself, toward the fact that things no longer worked the way they used to. And still no one asked me why. That silence confirmed everything I needed to know. They weren't interested in understanding boundaries. They were interested in restoring convenience. I stayed steady, polite, unchanged. I didn't correct their assumptions or defend my choices. I didn't offer reassurance that things would go back to normal, because this was the new normal. Watching the consequences unfold without intervening was harder than I expected. Not emotionally, but ethically. I had to resist the urge to step in, to help smooth things over the way I always had. But I knew that doing so would undo everything. Growth requires friction, not conflict, friction. And for the first time, the friction wasn't mine to absorb. As the days passed, the confusion sharpened into something else, concern. Because when systems fail quietly, people eventually realize they've lost control. And that realization was getting closer. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, the window to fix it had already closed. The confusion had hardened into urgency. What had once been brushed off as a delay or a technical issue was now unmistakably a barrier. Conversations grew shorter, voices lowered, plans were revisited, then postponed. And still, no one came to me directly. That was the part that stayed with me. Instead of asking what had changed, they tried to work around it. Instead of questioning assumptions, they doubled down on them. They searched for solutions that didn't require acknowledging the absence of access they had taken for granted. I watched it unfold with a strange mix of distance and familiarity. I had spent years doing exactly this, working around discomfort instead of naming it. Now the pattern had simply shifted away from me. Eventually, the questions became less casual. Someone asked if I had updated something recently. Someone else wondered aloud whether I had moved things around. The tone was careful, probing, almost hopeful. I answered honestly, but minimally. "I made some changes," I said. Nothing more. That was the first crack. The room went quiet in a way that wasn't hostile, but uncertain. People glanced at each other, recalibrating. They were searching for context, for a version of the story where this was temporary, reversible, negotiable. I didn't offer one. What followed wasn't anger. It was bargaining. Suggestions surfaced quickly. We could talk it through. We could figure something out. There were reminders of history, of trust, of family. The implication was clear. Whatever I had done could be undone if we handled it the right way. I listened carefully. And that's when I realized it was already too late, not because I refused to change my mind, but because the change had done its work. The access was gone. The system had reorganized itself around that absence. Restoring it wouldn't bring us back to where we were. It would require me to willingly step back into a role I had outgrown. And I wasn't willing to do that. I didn't explain all of this. I didn't need to. I simply said, this works better for me. That sentence landed heavier than anything I could have argued, because it didn't invite debate, it didn't accuse, it didn't justify, it stated reality. There was a pause after that, longer than the others. People struggle most when they realize they can't appeal to your emotions anymore, when guilt doesn't land, when familiarity doesn't soften the boundary. I could see the shift in their expressions the moment they understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. Regret surfaced then, not necessarily for what had been done, but for how it had been handled, for the assumption that I would always be available, that I would always adapt. Someone said quietly, "We didn't think it would matter this much." And that was the truth. It hadn't mattered until it did. I didn't respond to that statement. There was nothing to add. My silence wasn't punishment, it was an acknowledgement. They were coming to terms with a loss they hadn't known they were risking. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, no sense of victory, just a steady awareness that the balance had shifted permanently. Some things can be repaired with conversation. Some patterns dissolve with awareness. But once access is removed, once authority is reclaimed, the relationship must either evolve or accept the distance. By the end of that conversation, nothing had been resolved, and everything had changed. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was quieter than anyone expected. No raised voices, no dramatic pauses, just a conversation that could no longer be avoided. We were sitting in the same living room where so many decisions had once been made without me. The familiarity of the space contrasted sharply with how different I felt inside it now. I wasn't bracing myself. I wasn't rehearsing what to say. I was simply present. Someone spoke first. They explained their intentions, carefully, slowly. There was no defensiveness in their tone, only justification. They talked about urgency, about family responsibility, about how they assumed I would understand because I always had. I listened without interrupting. When they finished, there was an expectant silence, the kind that waits for reassurance, for softening, for the familiar signal that everything would be okay. I didn't give it. Instead, I said something simple. "I understand why you did it," I said. "I don't agree with how it was done." That distinction mattered. Understanding did not equal permission. Empathy did not cancel impact. They looked relieved for a moment until they realized I wasn't moving past it. Another explanation followed, a reminder of history, of how much we'd all done for each other, of how this was never meant to hurt me. I nodded. "I know," I said, and I meant it. Then I added, "That's why I changed the structure." The word structure shifted the tone. It moved the conversation out of emotion and into reality. They weren't being accused of being bad people. They were being told the system no longer worked. Someone asked if I would consider changing it back. I didn't hesitate. "No," I said. There was no anger in my voice, no defensiveness, just clarity. They asked why. And this time I answered, not to persuade them, but to define myself. "Because my consent should never be assumed," I said, "and because I don't want to live in a position where explaining myself is the only protection I have." That was the closest I came to confrontation. No one argued after that. They couldn't, not because they agreed, but because there was nothing to push against. I wasn't asking them to feel differently. I wasn't demanding acknowledgement. I was stating a boundary that existed regardless of their reaction. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was contemplative. I could see them processing not just what I had done, but who I was now. The version of me who didn't rush to reassure, who didn't absorb discomfort on their behalf, who didn't trade clarity for peace. Someone finally said, "We wish you'd told us sooner." I considered that for a moment. Then I said, "I wish you'd asked." That was it. No final statements, no emotional release. just an exchange that marked the end of something unspoken and the beginning of something more honest. When I left that evening, nothing felt unresolved. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for permission to define my own limits. Who I am now looks very similar to who I was before, at least on the surface. I still speak calmly. I still listen more than I talk. I still value thoughtfulness over reaction. But something fundamental has changed beneath that familiar exterior. I no longer confuse peace with self-erasure. For a long time, I believed being reasonable meant being flexible at my own expense. I thought maturity was measured by how much discomfort I could absorb without complaint. I mistook endurance for strength. Now I understand that strength is not how much you can tolerate, it's how clearly you can decide. I didn't become colder after everything that happened. If anything, I became more precise. I stopped offering access where there was no accountability. I stopped assuming responsibility for outcomes I didn't choose, and I stopped explaining myself to people who only listened when it was convenient. That clarity reshaped my relationships. Some grew quieter, more distant, not out of conflict, but because the old dynamic no longer existed to sustain them. Others adjusted, slowly, awkwardly, but genuinely. They learned to ask instead of assume, to pause instead of proceeding. I let those changes happen without forcing them, because I no longer believe it's my job to manage how others feel about my boundaries. What surprised me most was how much lighter my life became. Not easier, but lighter. The constant background effort of staying agreeable, staying available, staying invisible had drained more energy than I realized. Without it, I had room to breathe. I became more intentional with my time, more deliberate with my generosity. When I said yes, it meant something. When I said no, it didn't come with guilt or explanation. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply living in alignment with myself. The money, the $25,000, was eventually returned. Quietly, without ceremony. It mattered, of course, but by then it wasn't the point anymore. What mattered was that my life no longer depended on other people's restraint. I had redesigned it so that my safety didn't require constant vigilance. I still believe in family. I still value connection, but I no longer believe closeness justifies access. Trust, to me now, is something that exists alongside boundaries, not instead of them. And I've made peace with the fact that some people preferred the old version of me, the one who didn't require adjustment, the one who made things easier, the one who stayed quiet long enough for others to decide on her behalf. I don't resent them for that. They were responding to what I allowed, but I don't live there anymore. Who I am now is someone who understands that quiet does not mean passive, that calm does not mean compliant, that you can be compassionate without being available to misuse. I am still steady, but now I am also sovereign. There's a reason I chose to tell this story slowly. Not because the moment they took $25,000 from my savings wasn't significant, but because moments like that don't happen in isolation. They grow out of patterns, out of silence repeated often enough that it becomes permission, out of love mixed with entitlement until the line between care and control blurs. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that boundaries don't fail all at once. They erode quietly, especially when you're the one who's always understanding, especially in families where history is used as justification and closeness is mistaken for consent. I didn't lose my voice because someone took it from me. I misplaced it by believing that peace required my constant accommodation. And I didn't get it back by shouting. I got it back by choosing clarity over comfort, by redesigning my life so that my safety didn't depend on being endlessly agreeable, by understanding that you don't owe access to anyone, no matter how close they are, simply because you've always given it before. This story isn't about cutting people off. It's about cutting patterns off. It's about recognizing when being the easy one starts costing you parts of yourself, when your calm is mistaken for consent, when your silence is interpreted as approval. If you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't need to explain your boundaries for them to be real. You don't need anger to justify change, and you don't need permission to protect what matters to you. Sometimes the most powerful shift is the one no one sees until it's already done. I'm sharing this not to position myself as right or others as wrong, but to offer a mirror. Because if you've ever felt overlooked, assumed, or quietly overstepped, you're not alone. And you're not unreasonable for wanting something different. I believe in accountability without cruelty, in strength without spectacle, in choosing yourself without needing to destroy anyone else in the process. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about self-respect. So I'll leave you with this, not as a lesson, but as an invitation to reflect. Have you ever realized that staying silent was slowly teaching people how much of you they were allowed to take? And if so, what would change if you stopped? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not just what you think of what I did, but what it brought up for you. Because sometimes telling the truth quietly is how change begins.